Hello, guys. Well, welcome to the Beyond Autoimmunity podcast. We are excited to get into this topic today. We have a few different things. We're going to be talking about the GALT, immune tolerance, and oral tolerance. So, if you are tuning in for the first time and those terms already just went way above your head, we got something good for you. So, if you're a practitioner that's listening to this, we promise that there's going to be something for you. But similarly, if you're someone that's like, I'm not a practitioner, I never want to be one, I just came to listen here today so that I could learn more stuff for my own autoimmune condition. We promise that that's going to be the case for you as well. And we're purposely going to try to keep this to about 30 minutes so that if there is something that goes a bit over your head, or you're listening to this while you're in the car, while you're in the kitchen, and you're like, wait, what did they say? You could still rewind easily or listen again. And considering how long some podcasts go nowadays, are like 2-3 hours, basically you could listen to ours 4 or 5 times in the amount of times that you'd get to listen to one long form podcast nowadays. So Ryan, thank you for being here with me, of course.
Glad to be here. I'm glad to be doing this. This is a really important topic, obviously one that is pretty close to home and near and dear to both of our hearts, given that, we primarily work with people dealing with autoimmune conditions. And that's also how we got into this business to begin with, to almost help to restore our own, autoimmune conditions naturally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. So when people, I'm going to set the stage for this because when people get diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, they're going to end up in the hands of Western medicine typically. And one thing, again, especially since this is earlier on in our episodes and podcast here, for those that might be brand new to us, we are not against many Western medicine practitioners, although I'm sure there's some bad apples out there, but there's bad apples in any space that we're against. We are adamantly against the system, especially as it works for autoimmune conditions in many ways, right? There's a lot of times that autoimmune conditions especially do not get served properly by the Western medicine system. So when you get diagnosed, the first thing that's typically going to attempted to be done, depending on the condition that you have, is we're going to focus on saying, again, assuming we're Western medicine, so I'm not saying we'll do this literally, but they're going to focus on how do we suppress the immune response? How do we turn this down? And this is something that you will be able, if you think about this, you're going to be able to see this in all branches of Western medicine for the rest of your life, unless something major changes, which we pray that happens. But I don't know that we're getting anywhere close to that necessarily. What they do is they look at the problem at the most surface level, and then we address that. So it's an autoimmune condition. The immune system is ordering some response on the body and attacking itself. So it must be the immune system that we need to suppress. We never look at anything else. From a functional perspective, we go a step further, which is not, you don't have to be a genius for this. It's not necessarily that profound. You just say, well, why would my own immune system be attacking a part of my body? Why would that happen? Is there any chance that perhaps there's some miscommunication here that's leading to something like this? And that's a reasonable question, I think. I think that's totally fair. And then that question might lead to, okay, well, if that were to exist, what would be some of the things that contribute to that miscommunication, that misfiring? And thankfully, Ryan, we are starting to see not only just in the world of anecdotes of functional medicine, which there are a lot, and they're meaningful, right? When someone tries a diet like Dr. Terry Walls, right? She had MS and she's walking around now. She was in a wheelchair at one point, lecturing all over the world. That was more of an anecdote with many of her things at one point, just saying, hey, this seemed to work for me. But now the clinical literature is starting to back up some of these things that we were experiencing in the functional healthcare world for years. So you tell me, what do you think is the smartest one to start with between the GALT, immune tolerance, and oral tolerance?
Yeah, it's a really great way to set it up, right? So I think the underlying question is, why does the immune system become dysregulated in the first place, right?
Yes, fair enough.
We don't want to just stop by assuming these things just happen, right, randomly. And I think there is sort of a presupposition or an assumption a lot of times with chronic illness, like autoimmunity, that it's purely genetic and it was sort of predestined, predetermined. There's nothing that I can do that I have within my control, within my own toolkit, to be able to reverse this or at best manage the condition. So obviously we think very, very differently, right? From a functional holistic perspective. We've been able to successfully reverse or successfully manage our own autoimmune conditions. Obviously, we've done that with hundreds of clients as well. So we've seen that this can actually work for people. So I think that that is really important to emphasize that sense of agency, that we do actually have a lot more control over these things than we realize. All right. So, but to answer your question about where to start here, you had mentioned the GALT. Okay. So the GALT is the gut associated lymphoid tissue. All right. So what we're really talking about there is the housing for the entire immune system, which resides in the gut. Right. This lymphoid tissue where the majority of our immune cells actually make their home. So to keep it really simple, when we're talking about the gut environment, this is actually really, really fascinating to think about, that 80%, I'll say that again, 80% of our entire immune system resides in the gut environment. Not 80% in the lungs, not 80% in the heart or the brain, 80% in the gut environment. So if we think about this like from an engineering perspective, like if I'm like designing the human body, why would I want the vast majority of the immune system to reside in the gut? And the answer is actually fairly simple, is that every single thing we get exposed to, everything we eat and drink, ultimately makes its way into the gut. In a sense, we're sort of like a human funnel, right? And everything funnels its way down into the gut, including the lymphatic system, right? Because even toxins that we're eliminating through the body ultimately get filtered out through this drainage garbage disposal system, the lymphatic system, right? And then a good majority of toxins that we eliminate, we defecate, we poop them out, right? But back to this point, right? 80% of the immune system resides in the gut. So why would we want to design the body that way? Well, if everything we get exposed to ultimately makes its way into the gut, we ought to have a system in place to, I like to say, surveil, like a surveillance system, to surveil what's coming through, to keep everything in check, and to protect us, really, at the end of the day, ultimately, to protect us so that the immune system, as it's scanning or surveilling everything coming through, it can make sure that we're not getting exposed to something that's a genuine threat, that it then has to actually go to work to mount an inflammatory response or to neutralize that threat through various different mechanisms, right, to contain that issue. So as we're introducing all these like foreign antigens, right, into our system, and actually to quickly define what is an antigen, the word antigen, it literally breaks down into antibody generator, antigen, antibody generator. The word antigen is completely neutral, right? It doesn't necessarily imply something bad, which you might think it would because it starts with the prefix anti, like antigen, right? But the anti part stands for antibody. So it's really a very neutral term for anything coming through the gut environment, right? An antigen is not inherently bad. It's like all the food that we eat, those are potential antigens. The bacteria, the good bacteria in our own gut, those are potential antigens, right? And so the immune system is tasked, so to speak, with this very important work of making the distinction between what is friend and what is foe. As everything is coming through, nothing gets by the scanner. Right? And I'm gonna make this analogy multiple times today with this sort of like the security checkpoint at an airport, right? The TSA agents, right? Nothing gets by the scanner. Would you agree?
I have not gotten anything through myself. Not that I've
Good.
tried, of course.
You're not getting on that plane, right? Unless you go through security and you run your bags through the scanner and you go through the body scanner and so forth. So hopefully that kind of sets the stage, and I think it's really important to start there with that very basic understanding of the very critical, crucial role that the immune system plays in the gut, and then we can build from there.
Sure. And I want to, I'm sorry if this is jumping ahead. This is something that's obviously very exciting for nerds like us and hopefully for the audience. One of the things that people, I could picture them even challenging it from the moment that we talked about it. It's like, well, of course you have to suppress the immune system because that's what um, is happening, right? That's how you're getting the symptoms. It's like, well, let's take a step back here then with that. What's actually happened is that because of our modern world and the amount of insults that are happening on a daily basis, I mean, we're exposed to things that just didn't exist for our ancestors. That's one aspect.
Mhm.
And the abundance in which we are exposed to these things is never ending. And then the other problem is as your body starts to, I hate to use words like this because I do think words have power in our mind. And I don't just mean that in some hippie woo woo way, but genuinely, I think that the words matter, but I can't think of a better one live. So we're going to say as your body begins to weaken a little bit, it doesn't have as much of that vital reserve that we sometimes refer to in the functional space.
Mm.
All of a sudden now it's like this vicious cycle. And what I mean by that is as the gut breaks down, you might also start reacting to foods that you were totally fine with at one point. You had an oral tolerance for it. So again, we'll touch on that in a little bit.
Mm.
And no longer are you able to tolerate these things. So what does that do though? That is going to amplify this immune and inflammatory response, which of course makes it even worse all across the board.
Mm.
So for a lot of people, we've worked with these individuals. It's not everyone that we work with at Autoimmune Recovery Lab, but you'll work with individuals sometimes that, I mean, they react to everything, man. And they are not lying. These are not hypochondriacs that
Oh,
just
yeah.
think they're reacting to everything. It's like they will come to you and say, I'm down to 5 foods. I can't take supplements because I feel like heck when I take any of these things. I break out in a rash or hives. They are so far past the point of immune activation or immune tolerance. They're now in what we've learned as immune exhaustion. And
Mhm.
for those that are maybe coming and watching this from other shows that Ryan and I have done, again, sorry if this won't make as much sense for people that are brand new, but for people that have watched other shows that we've done, I was able to connect this idea with Ryan, and I always he's the clinical mind here, right? I just like the business side a little bit more. He's the clinical genius. So I was checking with him. I'm like, does this make sense? Because if the ideal is the immune tolerance, and then after that's immune activation, which most of us are experiencing in abundance in
Mm.
today's world. And then some of us go a step further, like you and I have gotten here to some degree, which is this immune exhaustion.
Mm.
Does that not relate to these phases of HPA axis dysfunction that we've talked about for many years on different podcasts that we've done? And so, just to connect these ideas for those that are not familiar, HPA axis dysfunction refers to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So, I'm going to oversimplify this completely just so that we can talk to the folks out there that are not on the practitioner side. Just picture your basic hormonal output, the basic ability to get up and go. We're talking cortisol, all that kind of stuff, just stuff that you need for daily life. You're not even able to produce that in the amounts that are necessary for the stress that your body's experiencing. Now, with HPA axis dysfunction, you have this homeostasis, we call it. So you're able to handle the amount of stress. And then after that, you go into this acute phase. So that means you are under more stress than you should be. But
Mhm.
since your body still has that vital reserve, maybe you're young, maybe you just have good genetics for that specific thing, you don't actually know how much stress your body is under. Normally, people can't perceive this properly because what's happening is the cortisol and the other hormones are outputting so high that you just feel like, hey, I'm a little wired, but I'm able to handle this. And Ryan, we've used this analogy a million times. This is often the people that they had some college days, right? They're able to stay out till 4 in the morning. They sleep for
Mm.
4 hours, and then they're at their part-time job by 9 a.m. And of course, they were never doing anything like drinking or drugs during that time that they were up late at night in college. And yes, you don't feel ideal the next day. You might have a headache or whatever. But the fact that you're able to even do that to some degree implies that you're probably more in that acute phase. And then comes the compensatory, which there's only 3 phases with the immune stuff. There's 4 phases with the HPA axis dysfunction. So I'm going to say that the acute and compensatory probably, fall in together to some degree in immune activation. And then finally, you have this HPA axis final stage, which is the exhaustive phase, as I've been taught it. And then I
Mhm.
saw immune exhaustion as well. And I said, how many people, Ryan, do you think if we were to test them would not only show this immune exhaustion, but we'd also see that their HPA axis was completely tanked? So, guys, even if
Mm.
you don't understand all that right now, because I understand we just threw a lot at you,
Mm.
one of the reasons that I'm mentioning that, though, is to already show you how we're different in our way of thinking. Western medicine, not because the practitioners or the doctors or nurses are bad. My sister's is a nurse, for gosh sake.
Mm.
They are not taught these things. They're not taught a holistic model. So they'll just treat it from the immune perspective, say we need to suppress the immune system. But I'm asking, well, wait, if these other areas of the body are tanked, maybe this person has, in the most simplistic way, been under chronic stress. Is there anything
Mm.
that we can do? Just a question. Is there anything that we can do about that chronic stress to help restore these different functions and areas of the body? Like, what a concept, right?
I love all of that. So what I'd like to do is kind of do a brief recap there, and then
Thanks.
also link what you're talking about here with stress, and
Mhm.
ultimately how that can impact gut immune function, and then we'll tie that into this topic of immune tolerance, right? So what Evan is referring to here, the HPA axis, I like to just think of as the body's stress management system. And if I keep it really, really simple,
Mhm.
um, ultimately over time, with repeated stressors, repeated insults, that stress management system becomes weakened over time, right? It becomes compromised. And therefore, our tolerance to stress becomes weaker, right? We can't stay up late anymore. We can't eat as much junk food anymore. Maybe our nervous system is a little bit more wired than it used to be. So we can't handle watching like violent TV shows anymore, like the way we used to when we were younger, right? Those are a few examples. Or maybe you just feel burnt out and exhausted all the time and you're not sure why, right? Those are surefire signs that your HPA axis, the stress management system, is likely compromised or even exhausted or tanked, right? And there is a very similar parallel to what happens with the immune system.
Yeah.
So let's kind of bridge the two. But before we do that, I want to start with kind of defining more terms here, talking about immune tolerance, right? So simply stated, we talked about how the majority of the immune system resides in the gut. But so that's a lot, right? 80%
Mhm.
making its home there. And one of the primary tasks that your immune system has to accomplish day in, day out, on a moment to moment basis, is distinguishing between friend and foe, right? Now, here's what's interesting. Just as the default state of that stress management system, the HPA axis, is what we call eustress, right? That's the adaptive phase of that stress management system, right? So we want good flexibility, we want good adaptability. In that default state of the immune system is to intelligently discriminate, right? These antigens in its environment. And the key word with immune tolerance is restraint, right? That's a really key concept and term for the purposes of this conversation today. The default healthy state of a normal, healthy functioning immune system is restraint. It's actually sort of doing nothing, except it's not exactly doing nothing. This is an active process. So, again, going back to that TSA security checkpoint analogy, you wouldn't say that those TSA agents are just kind of taking a nap and sitting on their butts, right? And just because if they were to be doing that, then anyone could just get right through security unchecked, right? So this is an active process of ignoring things. So I don't know about you, but for the majority of times I've ever been through security, I've never personally witnessed, aside from a TSA agent pulling someone aside to do like what is it called, a body scan,
Mhm.
like a pat down, I guess is the word. I've never seen any kind of urgent scenario arise where they had to call in like the next tier of security and pull that person aside into another room to interrogate them. I know that does happen, but the point is it's really rare, right? So 99.99% of the time when we go through security, they are the active default state is restraint. They're actively scanning everything that's going through the environment, but they're ultimately doing nothing, right? So they're checking things out to make sure it's safe. And then they go, okay, cool. We're good with this person and their bags and their belongings. They can get right through security. That's actually how a healthy immune system normally should function. But imagine here for a second that that was not the case. And the TSA agents reacted potentially violently to almost every single person that came through security, right? That would obviously, first and foremost, be extremely inefficient, right? And that would deter most people from ever even traveling. right? And then the airlines would go out of business. Like there'd be this domino effect. It'd be total chaos, right? There'd be lawsuits. I mean, you can go on and on with this analogy. Essentially, this is what happens to people who lose immune tolerance. Their immune system loses the ability to intelligently discriminate, to practice restraint. And instead of practicing restraint, it is then actively or even overactively responding to antigens, which I said earlier should be kind of neutral. And it's perceiving those antigens now as being a real credible threat, right? So now, and there's lots of ways we can go deeper into this, like the actual mechanics of the immunology and the breakdown of the mucosal barrier and all that. But just starting from that point, right? Loss of immune tolerance is when the immune system loses this ability to intelligently discriminate. Then the immune system can start mounting inflammatory responses to everything from benign food proteins to commensal gut bacteria, as in like your good normal bacteria or flora in your gut, like the good guys, right? It's going after the wrong thing. Or in the case of autoimmunity, and this is key, even your body's own tissue, right? So this loss of immune tolerance is really key to understanding how autoimmunity develops because it starts in the gut. This whole ordeal starts in the gut. That's why we say all the time in the functional medicine world, all disease begins in the gut, or conversely, all health and wellness begins in the gut, depending on the terrain and the context of that environment. Right. So happy to unpack that more. But before I forget, one additional piece to bring into this, which is extremely important, and it also hints at how we can improve this situation, is tying stress to this loss of immune tolerance, because they are very, very much directly related. All right. So let's say you're in that exhaustive state with your stress management system, that HPA axis. So your cortisol is tanked, right? You've got no reserve, as you called it. So there is this very important immune protein or immune globulin in the gut called secretory IgA, or CGA for short. It's arguably the most important immune cell in the entire gut environment. I believe it's the most abundant immune globulin in the gut, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to briefly describe how it works because it's really, really interesting. Secretory IgA works through something called immune exclusion, essentially meaning its aim is to neutralize or compartmentalize potential threats in a very sort of like low key way without triggering an inflammatory immune response. So essentially what that means, immune exclusion, is that the secretory IgA will bind to a potential threat. It will bind to an antigen. And once it binds to that antigen, it's essentially telling the immune system to ignore it, right? That once that secretory IgA attaches, then it's safe. It's safe from any kind of like immune reactivity. Does that make sense so far?
So far, yes.
Right. All right. So this is extremely important, right? Because that's key to a really calm, balanced immune response in the gut to prevent loss of immune tolerance, to prevent this hyperreactivity. Here's the link with stress. What we know from both the clinical literature and from just thousands of real world anecdotes, that what suppresses that secretory IgA more than anything else, and I've seen this play out over 1,000 times because I've been running these gut tests for over a decade. The number one thing that will suppress that secretory IgA is stress, right? And there's no way to supplement your way out of that until you address it head on and you regulate your stress response, you regulate the nervous system response. So when there's not enough secretory IgA, you don't get that benefit of that immune exclusion, right? So there's nothing to tell the rest of the immune system like, hey, this antigen here is not a problem. You don't need to go after it. that's no longer present, right? So then this is interesting. You mentioned mast cells earlier. What takes over in its place when secretory IgA is too low are IgE mediated responses, like allergies, allergic responses, and mast cells,
Hmm.
right? Because something has to do the job if secretory IgA can't, right? So now you're then in a situation where you're hyperreactive to everything. You might actually present with this kind of mast cell activation syndrome type presentation. You will likely react to almost anything you put in your body, whether it's food or supplements, etc. And you're likely also then to be one of these people that tries out every supplement under the sun to try to resolve this issue. But that may neglect to understand the actual ways that this develops in the first place. And stress is a big factor, but we can also talk about other ways to resolve this as well.
It's amazing how 30 minutes will never be enough for you and I. And don't worry, guys, we're going to continue this for a little bit and then we're going to have a nice part two on this exact same topic. But with that said, I want to define a couple of things or follow up with a couple of things. So, the way that it was worded, and that's why I want a correction here if this is the case or not the case,
Sure.
when you talked about immune tolerance, it almost seemed like the loss of immune tolerance is a prerequisite for an autoimmune condition. Are we far enough in the research to say that definitively yet, if that interpretation is even correct? Or do you think it's correct, but maybe we're not far enough yet to definitively conclude that? Because the reason that I look at that as a good thing is because, guys, we're not making any medical claims, but we do know that immune tolerance is something that absolutely can be restored. We see that. So I'm thinking,
Mm.
put two and two together here. If this is something that almost acts as a prerequisite for many people's autoimmune conditions, if not all of them, well, all I can say is that's good news. So
Yeah.
you tell me, is that seeming to be a prerequisite? Do we already know it is, or are we not quite there yet?
I think we're very close to be able to saying that definitively. In my view, at least from a functional holistic perspective, it's pretty settled. Yeah, that mechanistically, autoimmunity. If I were to even define what is an autoimmune condition, my answer would probably be a scenario in which the immune system loses the ability to distinguish between something that's benign and a real threat, and it loses the ability to make that distinction. And that breakdown occurs in the gut. It occurs with stress. It occurs with microbial imbalances, breakdown with the mucosal barrier. So here's one quick real world example. If your secretory IgA levels are really low or suppressed, and at the same time you have leaky gut, that's a perfect storm for autoimmunity. Because at least if you have adequate amounts of that immune cell, the secretory IgA, it can sort of grab onto potential uh, things, antigens that might become pathogenic. It can bind onto those and neutralize them and prevent this sort of like inflammatory immune response. But and not only that, but when the secretory IgA binds to an antigen, it's now like a larger molecule
Hmm.
that's harder to leak through the gut. Whoa, like that's a pretty big piece of it, right? So without secretory IgA, you have things like food antigens, bacteria, toxins, what have you, that are now more easily able to leak through the mucosal barrier, right? This kind of protective coating that lines the intestinal tract. So then you have things leaking into the bloodstream, and that creates a heightened inflammatory response that's now global. It's systemic because now the problem is outside of the gut.
Uh-huh.
And that could lead to molecular mimicry, where the immune system thinks like a protein from gluten that's leaking into your bloodstream is the same protein in your muscle or joints. And so what does it do? Well, it can't tell the difference between the two. So it's going to go after both. And it's going to mistakenly or inadvertently start going after your body's own tissue, right? So yeah, can't emphasize enough that breakdown one way or another. And there's lots of ways this can develop, but one way or another, the issue starts or originates in the gut.
So interesting. And for us as nerds and practitioners, and the practitioners that are listening are probably excited too, but you should be even more excited technically if you're a client, a patient of a doctor, or just someone that's dealing with an autoimmune condition. What Ryan and I and other practitioners too, to be fair, we're seeing for years, because both him and I have been in this about a decade or more. You were you're doing these holistic things that to be good with the individual. And again, we're not treating anything. It's not like we're playing doctor. We're literally just helping them on the more holistic side of things, using advanced lab analysis, right? I kind of consider that sometimes like the best of Western science with more Eastern modalities, right? And it's not just Eastern, it's not just Western. It's a beautiful blend of both. But Eastern modalities are not inventing things like the GI map and the HTMA and all that stuff. That's Western science that does that, which is great.
Mm.
And then you use those labs and to apply these holistic principles, and you are amazed by how much people get better. So what we were seeing is you're doing these things that to be good for pretty much anyone. And sometimes I'd have clients coming back saying, hey, I was able to talk to my doctor and I don't need this medication anymore. Now imagine that. We never have to have that conversation with them because that'd be out of scope, right? We can't, even if we wanted
Of
to, we can't tell a client to get off medication. But they
course.
end up feeling so much better that often they're able to do this, or the
Mm.
dose is so low and so manageable. Ryan shares this very publicly. Ryan takes a thyroid medication, but you'd never know that he has an issue at all because his symptoms are pretty much completely managed. And this is sad in a separate podcast and topic. The reality is, people on medication, that does not mean that their symptoms are managed, especially for autoimmune conditions. Anyone that has been on a medication for an autoimmune disease long term will almost universally tell you, assuming that they're not doing this holistic stuff, that this has been a roller coaster. It's up one second, it's down the next, and they're constantly battling, trying to find that right dose for that specific time in their life. But the reason that it's exciting for all of us is because what was just kind of happening organically before, now the science is backing this up. And that gives us more direction as functional practitioners to say, okay, I can't treat or cure anything. But what I can do is help this individual through a self-treatment program address some of these things, put some more emphasis. Let's really make sure we heal and seal the gut. Let's really make sure we focus on your stress levels and all those types of things. And who knows what's possible with the healing. So I can say my belief, that's for sure. It's a personal opinion. I'm not representing any medical organization when I say it. It is my personal belief that almost everyone with an autoimmune condition can feel at least 90% better. And I do believe a lot of them, especially depending on when you were diagnosed,
Mm.
even have the potential to maybe be symptom-free one day. That is a personal belief. That's what I'm
Sure.
sharing it as. So, I'm sorry, because I know I added a lot there. So obviously, I want to
Mhm.
let you respond to that as well. But my second follow-up that I was referring to before is when you say, I've never seen someone get these secretory IgA levels back up until stress was managed. One thing I wanted to define for the audience, because when they think stress, they might be thinking, I'm in debt, I have student loans out the wazoo, or I'm in a bad
Yeah.
relationship. And all of that's correct, but I do think you probably even meant more than that. So sorry to hit you with a few things, but you're pretty good at handling me after all these years.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, that's a good point, Evan. So, yeah, we do define stress very broadly in this context. So, yes, absolutely, stress can include everything you just mentioned. And in some cases, it can include trauma, early childhood trauma, abuse, neglect. These sort of things are very real for some people, and they can essentially rewire your brain and your nervous system to the point where your body's stuck in a sort of cell danger response. And this is where your body goes from promoting health and physiology to kind of shutting down. It's a protective response. That being said, stress can also encompass what I call physiological stress. So these are things like gut bugs or pathogens, toxins would be a huge category, right? That's something I test for every single person that comes through the door is looking at the toxic burden. That's going to be really significant. Nutrient deficiencies can actually represent a significant stress on the body. If we're lacking the raw materials that our cells need to actually perform their normal everyday metabolic functions. Let's say, for example, the mitochondria, when we're looking at the process of energy production, the mitochondria are like the energy powerhouses of the cell, right? This is where the Krebs cycle happens, the electron transport chain, stuff we learned in high school biology or physiology that we never wanted to remember again, right? But those processes rely heavily on things like B vitamins, CoQ10, uh, minerals and elements like magnesium and copper and so on, right? So that's a stress to the body if we don't have the nutrients we need to facilitate energy production. So yeah, as you can see, stresses can go way beyond just yeah, having student debt. And but you know, the issue I think many people encounter today is, you know, we might call it super stress or mega stress. I don't know. We have to come up with a unique patented word for it, maybe. But you add these insults all together because it's not as though the average person is just dealing with one of these. You know, the average person that we do a full lab analysis, what do we see? We see signs of that stress management system breaking down. We see nutrient deficiencies. We see hormone imbalances. We see a high burden of toxins, things like heavy metals or pesticides. We see evidence of microbial imbalances or breakdown to the mucosal barrier of the gut. You can just keep going and going and going. And the term I like to use all the time is a death by 1,000 cuts,
Mm.
right? It's not any one particular insult that's causing the issue. It's a combination of factors. That's why if you really want any, um, let's say, reliable chance of healing or repairing or reversing the symptoms of your condition, like you mentioned, up to 90%, you have to work on everything. You have to work on all of it. I always tell my clients, like, the last time I checked, we're one body. You can't really pick and choose. I'm just gonna, you know, support this one set of tissues, or I'm just gonna work on nutrients, but not on stress or not on detox, right? It all works together. I use the analogy all the time of like a symphony orchestra, where
Mhm.
the brass, the woodwinds, the strings, the percussion, it all has to be working together harmoniously in order to produce a pleasant result, right? As the listener and the audience. So um, that's why we like to say we kind of focus on everything non-specifically when we're healing the body. And when someone is dealing with a chronic condition, we have to look at all those factors in order to actually resolve, you know, and restore function.
Sure.
Yeah.
Guys, as we wrap up today, listen, the bottom line is this. The best bet is always going to be doing the lab workup and all that kind of stuff. But one of our goals on the show is, hey, if you don't have the ability to do the labs right now, you don't want to do it. You're like, I just met you guys 40 minutes ago, perhaps. You're just not ready for that commitment. That's fine. There are some other things that you can do. And so, Ryan, we don't want to overwhelm them today necessarily, but what are, the top 2 or 3 things that you would say, one could do to help kind of restore this immune tolerance? Again, maybe they can't do it perfectly without diving into some of the actual things that would show up on their unique labs, but certainly we could start moving it in the right direction. And
Yeah,
very often the things that we would even feel comfortable enough recommending somewhat generically on a podcast, we would ask you to do if you worked with us anyway. So you might as
that's
well
true.
do it for free. If I can, I mean, one thing that I always love talking about, and I would definitely, I don't know where this would fall in the top 3, but I think it would fall in for sure. Easiest win. Well, simplest win, not necessarily easy, right? Simple and easy are different things, but optimizing your sleep schedule. And the reason I know this
Mhm.
is because when I'll go back to what I said in the beginning, that kind of parallel that I started noticing between, oh, is there something here between this HPA axis dysfunction and this immune dysfunction, or let's call it immune exhaustion? Well, I know for me, when I was 21 years old, I actually tested in the exhaustive phase of HPA axis dysfunction. 21 years old, crazy, right? Now, when
Mm,
I ran the test again at 25, and of course, I had been doing the healing protocols and all these things for 5 years, but one of the main things that I did that really I never felt fully great until I nailed down the sleep side of things. When I got that done, when I say nail it down, I mean this is like 9 to 10 p.m., which guess what? I have not done perfectly over the last 10, 12 years of my life, but I also don't feel as bad as I used to. So guess what? There's times that you can have a little bit more flexibility as you get healthier. Now, do you want to push it constantly? No, no one here is suggesting that. But you do not have to live a life where it's 9 p.m., for the next 5 years straight. And if you differentiate from that schedule one time, you're going to die. That's ridiculous. We're not saying that either. But if you're willing to do that and be strict enough for a little bit, and this is a pretty good time of year to do this, right? You can't blame many holidays. You can't blame the summer yet. When this came out, this is in February of 2026. So you got a perfect amount of time to kind of get these things under control, if you ask me. Um, when I did that and when I tested again at 25 years old, I was actually only in a mild form of the acute phase of HPA axis
Mm.
dysfunction. And now, of course, one could say, well, Ev, you were still in HPA axis dysfunction. That's not great. Are you kidding me? A mild form of acute, meaning that my body did have the ability to put out the hormones that it needed and the stress response that it needed for what was going on in my life, but it only implied that there was a mild amount of excessive stressors going on. And grant you, this was during the beginning of COVID. So maybe it was just the mental stress of everything happening there that was able to get to me. I consider that a pretty big win personally. So that's one thing that I am positive if you're doing something to improve that HPA access, I would bet my life that you're going to be doing things that are also going to improve your immune tolerance as well. So I don't know where it falls in the top
Mm.
three, but that's my one. I'll contribute to the top three. What other two things would you say are in that top three for you, Ryan?
Sleep is absolutely foundational, non-negotiable even. If I were to add two more, and for the purposes of sticking with diet and lifestyle, right? Because really, when we get into the world of supplementation, it's usually, vastly preferred that we have some lab data to back up why we're using certain things, right? So if we were sticking to the foundations, things that people can implement, today, right away, I would start with a diet. Things like cutting out inflammatory foods. It can help also to journal, to do some food journaling, right? Without the benefit, say, of like a food sensitivity test, which is actually, that's a topic for another podcast, maybe. But I believe that they're problematic in some ways. But so starting with the diet, eliminating obvious inflammatory foods like added sugars, alcohol. For many people, we find gluten and dairy are problematic and they tend to feel better, sometimes very quickly, just eliminating those foods from the diet. Right. So, what we want to do is calm that inflammatory state in the body because when we're pushing the gut towards more inflammation, that biases that immune surveillance process towards, activation and towards autoimmunity. So that's going to be really crucial. Not just eliminating the bad stuff, but also promoting and what I like to say a very nutrient dense diet, focusing on foods that provide a lot of bang for the buck in terms of the amount of nutrient density per calorie. So that would include things like organ meats, lots of a variety of vegetables, and things like beans and legumes, even if you tolerate them. That may include salmon, avocados, blueberries, cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower. These are all very supportive of the liver because they're high in sulfur. Okay, so there's a lot we could do 10 episodes just on the diet, right? And then the second one, because you asked for two, would be the stress reduction component. Right. So where would I start if I just didn't even know? I didn't have the tools to know how to manage stress. Right? I might go on YouTube and there's probably 100 videos that'll walk you through how to do either something called box breathing, or there's another method called 4-7-8 breathing, which I actually prefer, the latter. And 4-7-8 breathing is where you're breathing in for a count of 4, holding it for 7, and then breathing out for 8. In reality, if the count is not exactly 4-7-8, really the idea is that your exhales are much longer than your inhales. So if it was 4-6-7, you'd still be right in the same ballpark. It's not to get caught up too much in perfection or the details. Um, when you're exhaling more slowly than you're breathing in, it can very quickly, within minutes, provides the right safety signals to your nervous system and put you in a more parasympathetic state. So many people are just breathing incorrectly. They're breathing very shallow. When you're breathing shallow and you're breathing very quickly, these are signs to your body, even if they're not conscious, that you're in a state of fight or flight. So correcting your breathing, I'm really huge on that. Okay. So that's just one example of stress reduction. It could be gratitude journaling, could be setting aside, 2 or 3 nights a week to do an Epsom salt bath. Maybe you book a massage once a week or once every other week. More time in nature walking in nature, hiking, that sort of thing. And it's not to say you have to go out and do all of these things because a lot of us have time constraints, but I do think it's important for regularity, right? Even if that means putting it in your calendar and holding yourself accountable, because nature loves a vacuum. If you have free time, it's going to get taken up by other responsibilities. So always do encourage people, put time in your calendar for intentional stress reduction. Don't think it's just going to happen magically unless you aside the time to do some breath work, to do some yoga, something that you gravitate towards, something you could see yourself enjoying and getting some value out of.
Absolutely. Ryan, thank you so much for today. And guys, this is just how we do things here. We are tending to go a little bit over, but we're doing our best to try to keep these to 30, 40 minutes so that you guys can digest as much as possible, and then be able to listen to us once again. So Autoimmune Recovery Lab on Instagram at Autoimmune Recovery Lab. You can follow us there. And if you'd like the show notes from this podcast today, the full transcription, and then any links to things that we've referenced, today wasn't too reference heavy, but this might happen in the future. So this is autoimmunerecoverylab.com/podcast1. That's autoimmunerecoverylab.com/podcast and the number 1. The first one we released was episode 0, just to make it extra confusing for you guys. So this one is autoimmunerecoverylab.com/podcast1. Please make sure you are subscribed. We release every week and possibly twice a week coming up soon if we deem that you guys are really loving what we're saying. And we're looking forward to talking to you next time. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Ev. Talk to you guys soon.